Today on CityCast Chicago, after months of campaigning and promises, now it's time to talk about what kind of mayor Commissioner Brandon Johnson will be. And there's a new city council in town. We've got results from some of the aldermanic runoffs. It's Wednesday, April 5th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. There was a whole lot of celebrating and dancing at the Johnson camp last night, where the mayor-elect painted a bright picture of Chicago's future under his leadership.
Today, the dream is alive. And so today, we celebrate the revival and the resurrection of the city of Chicago. It is time for Chicago to come alive. Come alive, Chicago. My name is Brandon Johnson, and I can't wait to be sworn in as the next mayor of the greatest city in the world, Chicago.
His opponent, Paul Vallis, took a conciliatory tone when he addressed his supporters last night.
Even though, of course, we believe every vote should be counted, I called Brandon Johnson and told him that I absolutely expect him to be the next mayor of Chicago. And please, it's critically important. I mean, this campaign that I ran to bring the city together would not be a campaign that fulfilled my ambitions if this election is going to divide us more.
It's 5 a.m. and I'm here with lead producer Carrie Shepard and producer Simone Alisea, who, again, I just want to thank y'all for all of the time, effort, critical coverage y'all have put in over these last months and months of election coverage. It was our first sort of municipal election together as a team. But before we get into the results, you know, everybody wants to talk about turnout when we look at our election. So, Simone, I got to bring you in here as our numbers guru. How did wards break down in terms of votes?
Yeah, by the end of election night, we were looking at about 35% citywide turnout, which is really good. That's better than what we saw on election night in February. And overall, after the mail-in ballots were counted in February, we saw like a 36% citywide turnout. So we're on track to beat what we saw in February. And it's also a little higher than it's higher than what we saw in 2019 as well during the generals and the runoffs there. And you know, as I mentioned, we do still have mail-in ballots to count. So all of the numbers that you might hear in this conversation could shift a little bit. As a result, we have, you know, in February, they counted something like 50,000 vote by mail ballots after, you know, Election Day. The Chicago Board of Elections has until April 18th to count all those, certify the results, and then put out an official proclamation around that time.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I kept hearing last night as I was flipping through the channels, kind of looking through the election coverage, is that, you know, when you started to look at the breakdown of, you know, who won what demographics, a lot of attention was starting to be paid towards, you know, 18 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 35, because the thought was that they would likely, if they come out, they'll be part of that undecided block that might carry Commissioner Johnson over. Well, was that the case when you look at younger voters, that 18 all the way up to maybe 35, even 40? What did that participation look like?
I mean, certainly we saw a really big increase, particularly in that 18 to 24 category. I mean, about, you know, more than 5,000 more young people came out to vote in April than they did in February. And so that's like a you know, a third more than who came out in February. Granted, you know, they're still only making up about 4% of the overall vote, that block. So it's not, you know, it's still not huge when you compare it to, you know, our 35 and overs. But it is a pretty remarkable difference. And I do think it speaks to a lot of the organizing that's happened over the course of this campaign.
Yeah, one thing you've heard from Johnson's camp and even Vallis's camp last night is that what they believe wanted for Johnson was not only this swell of energy from the organizing community, but this ground game that got out, that talked to youth voters, that was in community centers, that was knocking on people's doors, doing the mailers, doing the text groups together. We had the opportunity to sit down with Commissioner Brandon Johnson last month, and for people who might not be familiar with his story, Brandon Johnson was raised in a home with 9 other siblings out in Elgin, a suburb on the a western suburb of Chicago. His career and journey to City Hall largely started as a public school teacher on the near north side in the Cabrini Green neighborhood. He transitioned into being a lobbyist and organizer with the Chicago Teachers Union, helping to rally the Chicago Teachers Union in recent labor negotiations, even leading to a strike in 2015. And then once again, under the Lightfoot administration, trying to fight for more services. Brandon Johnson then went on in 2018 to win a Cook County commissioner seat in the 1st District, which stretches from the west side, where he raises a family with his wife and 3 kids in the Austin neighborhood, all the way out to Maywood suburb. And during that time, Johnson has talked that much of his focus has been on investing in public services, divesting from sort of the carceral systems and thinking of alternative ways of policing. And throughout his campaign, you saw Johnson really focusing on investing in people, right? He talked about trying to advocate for environmental issues. You saw Johnson talking about investing in neighborhood schools, providing more money for youth employment. And a campaign that 5 or 6 months ago, I don't think any single political pundit, any person watching the mayoral election thought that Brandon Johnson had enough name recognition and enough support
including Brandon
to
Johnson.
come out on top, including Brandon Johnson. And now we're here April 5th, and Johnson will, in the next month and a half, be inaugurated. Carrie, Simone, we got to talk about these sort of big issues that his campaign was centered around, right? With a history as a public school teacher, as somebody who worked closely with the Chicago Teachers Union, education is where a lot of Johnson's focus is a lot of where Johnson put his focus early in this campaign throughout. So where does Johnson fall when it comes to the future of Chicago public schools?
So, Jacoby, yeah, I think you nailed it with that bio. Like, a key tenet that he was going to rely on his campaign was his education bona fides, because that's where his, primarily where he spent his career. Very starkly different than his opponent, Paul Vallis, but in line with what we have heard from the Chicago Teachers Union, which isn't, super surprising. He wants to end this idea of, he actually called it this Hunger Games style form of funding that, the school, that funding is totally tied to enrollment. So what you see in that situation is you have these schools that are losing enrollment, which is a big issue in Chicago public schools right now. But mostly, in Black and brown neighborhoods, they don't get the resources they need, which leads to this cycle that they close, which we saw 10 years ago this year when former Mayor Rahm Emanuel closed 50 schools in mostly brown and Black neighborhoods. So Johnson made it very clear he does not want that anymore. He wants to take this sort of holistic approach and make sure student schools have all the funding they need, and including the money that they're owed from Springfield.
He wants to embrace the funding formula that would get Chicago about $1 billion more from the state to use inside of Chicago public schools.
Exactly. And another big thing that we hear is this wraparound services, which is kind of a catch term. But what that means is basically Johnson and the current leadership of the Teachers Union, they really want to see each student as, their education is more than outside the classroom. So they really want to, help students, services, programs that serve the whole student, which take into account students that are living in poverty, that take into account students that are living trauma from living in violence-ridden neighborhoods. He is saying, look, education is so much more than just what happens in the classroom. He's also going to have to negotiate a new contract with the Chicago Teachers Union alongside his former colleagues. And the moratorium on school closures, that's going to be lifted in 2025 during his tenure as mayor.
A $600 million budget deficit is
Yep.
coming up.
Yep.
An elected school board is coming up. The future of Chicago Public Schools, we talked about it over and over and over, both with ourselves, with our colleagues. It's at a very critical moment.
Totally.
And the decisions that are made over these next 4 years will shape Chicago Public Schools for the near future. Throughout Johnson's campaign, he often talked about wanting to bring nuance to these conversations. And that's not just education and the investments he plans to make there. But time and time again, the polls showed that for many people in Chicago, public safety, whatever that means to you, was one of these top issues. And so, of course, Johnson did his best to center this throughout the conversation in this campaign. Simone, what is Johnson's positions on public safety?
Yeah, so Johnson's public safety plan has primarily focused on services that are not policing, right? About reopening mental health clinics, getting health professionals to respond to crisis calls, housing unhoused residents, jobs for youth. Those sorts of things have kind of been the basis of what he thinks will reduce violence in the city, reduce crime in the city, essentially trying to kind of hit those issues at the source. Now, as far as the policing goes, he has said he wants to promote more detectives within the Chicago Police Department ranks. But he hasn't really been that interested in hiring more officers and filling, a bunch of vacancies like his opponent Paul Vallis has called for. And that was sort of the big debate throughout the campaign, right? Was, to what degree is staffing up the police department the answer, one of the answers? What role does that play in reducing crime in Chicago? He was sort of dogged by this question over the course of the campaign of like, do you plan to defund the police, quote unquote? And especially in the later weeks of the race, really tried to distance himself from that kind of language, says he does not support defunding the police. But he has said he does want to look at the police budget. How is it being used? Is it being used equitably? And so that is a question moving forward of kind of, it was a tightrope he was walking while he was running. And what side of the tightrope is he going to kind of come down on now that he's actually in office?
Exactly, because though he made no promises to sort of get back to that 2019 staffing level, people then ask, okay, so what would you do with that money? Will you reappropriate it? Will you leave it in the budget? If you get all of these, sort of additional services that pull away from the responsibilities of law enforcement in this city, what will you do with potentially those cost saving? And now that he's actually going to be inaugurated as the next mayor, I wonder how his tone changes on the conversation, because even as you listen to his acceptance speech, he still made room for law enforcement. He still considers, the future of Chicago to have a connection to law enforcement. And we'll see as we move forward sort of what he thinks that breakdown, that balance, that relationship should look like. Let's be real. We saw a lot of big questions being asked to Johnson, whether it's his taxation plan. You see a lot of fear mongering from people like John Catanzara, the leader of the FOP, who said, oh, there's going to be blood in the streets if Brandon Johnson wins. So now we're here, April 5th. I got to ask y'all, Carrie, what were some of those big questions Johnson faced on the campaign trail, and how did he navigate around them?
I think Simone nailed it with past comments about defunding the police, which he later clarified. But also he faced these and he's going to continue to face these, which is how's he going to pay for all these plans? His opponent, Paul Vallis, is a budget wonk. So he's sort of shorter on big plans, more on here's how I'm going to pay for what we've got. And, Johnson is a progressive and he has big ideas, and the big questions are, how are you going to fund it? Well, it always comes down to, are you going to raise property taxes? The reality is to pay for all of the things he has, all of his ideas, but also all the problems he's inheriting in terms of budgets, shortfalls, it's probably going to have to rely on a property tax hike. But so you said it, Jacoby. I think it's more just a lack of maybe experience in terms of management of how he's going to manage the city. That Paul Vallis went after that a lot. We should note though that Brandon Johnson has been elected to public office before. Paul Vallis has not, in that Brandon Johnson is a Cook County commissioner. So he faced a lot of that from Vallis on the campaign trail.
Yeah, so much of it came down to how are we going to pay for it? And your options really are, as you said, it's taxation, raising revenue. And Brandon Johnson has put out some plans for, raising this kind of money, anything from accommodations taxes, hotel taxes, taxes on businesses who have majority of the employees working outside of Chicago, taxation on real estate transfers over $1 million, jet fuel tax. And one of the things we brought up in our conversation with Johnson in our interview is, well, a lot of the places you were saying you're going to go after taxes, right? A lot of these impact people maybe who don't live in Chicago. People are visiting in Chicago. So on the campaign trail, it's easy to say, but these are often industries that have very large lobbying bodies that are going to fight taxation in a lot of ways. And one thing Mariah Woelfel pointed out in the conversation her and I recently had was, he could promise that he won't raise property taxes. But as we've said, that's not the only thing that factors in. So I won't raise your property taxes and your property tax bill won't go up are not the same
Very
thing.
different. Very different.
Right?
Yeah.
And no candidate can promise you that bill won't go up. But Simone, you also watched Brandon Johnson have to navigate a lot of dog whistling, both during the campaign season from opponents, but people said you're trying to make this about race, to people who had gone that has experience, what do you expect from Johnson sort of moving forward as he tries to, convince 49% of the city who did not vote for him that he has their best interest at heart?
It's interesting because I think both Johnson and Vallis in their speeches last night spoke to a division in the city, right? Vallis sort of speaking to, his own supporters saying, hey, we got to work with Johnson's administration. And there was, kind of a groan from the audience. As far as like what is ahead, one thing that I am going to be really interested to watch is for me, it's going to be all about budget season. It's going to be about the budget. To me, this is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to campaign promises. And I'm going to be basically looking at three things. A, is his budget going to look radically different than what we've seen from Mayor Lightfoot? Is he going to have some creative revenue raising ideas presented in a budget in the fall? B, how is he working with this new city council, right? The city council has to approve that budget. They have shown interest in trying to flex some more muscles over that process. Does that mean it's going to be more combative, or because we've got some progressive alders in there, does that mean it's going to be even smoother sailing for Johnson? We don't know yet. And then finally, I want to see, in addition to what's actually in the budget, what the dollars are, does the budgeting process change? He didn't talk about this too much on the campaign trail, but sort of an overall progressive goal is to create a more participatory budgeting system so that when I go to a town hall, when I fill out a survey about what I think the city should spend money on, I have some confidence that the city's actually listening to me. And that kind of stuff can start as early as this summer. We may not get an actual budget until the fall, but in terms of soliciting public opinion, that starts this summer. And so that to me is like a first true test of, okay, here's what the next 4 years under Johnson are going to look like.
Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody moving forward should expect Johnson, who is inheriting, as we said, not only the problems of the previous administrations, but generations of issues that impact not just Chicago, but major cities across America. But the thing I will be watching for, as I see this energy coming out of the Black organizing community in Chicago, when you think about labor organizing in this city, who very much have sold this message. You listened to the speech last night that we're waking up in a different Chicago, where we see different possibilities, where the city and the fifth floor of City Hall will work for working class people. But we've been given so many of those promises in campaign seasons past. I want to see what actually can a mayor who started as a public school teacher and an organizer, how much of those values, how much of those promises actually align with the mechanisms of the democratic system we have in place? Is the infrastructure and the institution of Chicago politics, are they capable of delivering on those promises? Not simply is Johnson able to craft policy and craft legislation that speaks to those values and direct money to programs that he believes invest in people, invest in neighborhoods, but is the political system of Chicago built to deliver on those promises? The energy across our city today is real. I think more people are invested in Chicago politics today than maybe they were a few months ago. And I think that can bode well for our city. Reminder, Commissioner Brandon Johnson will officially be sworn in May 15th. But he won't be the only new person in Chicago politics, right? Our city council has finally been decided on. We have 14 automatic runoffs. We're going to talk about a few of those key races that we've been covering throughout campaign season, starting on my side of the city with the 4th Ward, which is my home ward. It covers Hyde Park, Kenwood, Bronzeville, and South Loop. And unsurprisingly, State Representative Lamont Robinson was able to beat Prentice Butler, outgoing Alderperson Sophia King's former chief of staff. And Lamont Robinson, the reason I say it was unsurprising is because he came in with these major endorsements from people like Governor Pritzker, Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. And a lot of the issues here are about investment. When you think of Bronzeville, South Loop, what is the future of investment in these neighborhoods, particularly Bronzeville, a place that is still continuing its sort of slow gentrification process, in the South Loop? He's got a lot to think about when you start talking about Grant Park, the Bears maybe leaving Soldier Field. So, I'm interested to see what the future of my ward looks like. If you go a little bit further south of me, you're starting to look at the 5th Ward. That also includes parts of Hyde Park, but then Woodlawn and South Shore. With retiring Alderperson Leslie Hairston's endorsement, community organizer Desmond Yancey was able to defeat former city official Martina Tina Hone. And the big issue in South Shore is both the future of major developments like the Obama Center, the film studios that's coming to the south side of South Shore, and the future of affordable housing. You saw during the February round of elections that overwhelmingly residents in parts of South Shore and Woodlawn voted for increased protections in their neighborhood to make sure that they are not priced out as these developments come in. Carrie, I want to kick it to you. We're going to move a little further north to talk about the 11th Ward. What happened in this historically critical ward?
The 11th Ward, you say that is critical because it is the city's only Asian majority ward. So this includes Chinatown, Armour Square, but then more Latino neighborhoods, one mix of Latino and white neighborhoods, McKinley Park, but also Bridgeport, the long daily Democratic stronghold. And Nicole Lee, Alderwoman Nicole Lee, was elected. She was appointed by Lightfoot after the former alder Daley was convicted on corruption charges. So Nicole Lee in the 11th.
Moving from the 11th Ward on the south side, further northwest to the 30th Ward, what is the future of parts of Belmont, Cragen, and Avondale?
Yep, Belmont, Cragen, Avondale, Irving Park, Portage Park is the 30th. This is a majority Latino ward. Admissions director Ruth Cruz beat Jessica Gutierrez, and Jessica Gutierrez is the daughter of former U.S. Congressman Luis Gutierrez. Cruz had the backing of the outgoing alder, which, some saw actually as an impediment to her. Maybe some thought he wasn't as independent as they wanted him to be. So she had distanced herself a little bit from that endorsement, but it was enough for Ruth Cruz to beat Jessica Gutierrez in the 30th.
And then to your home ward of the 36th Ward on the sort of near west side of the city.
Yep, 36th Ward, Ukrainian Village, Humboldt Park, Montclair. Basically, this is the quote unquote like snake weird noodle ward that runs along Grand Avenue Northwest. Incumbent Gilbert Villegas was defeated CPS teacher and union organizer Lori Torres Witt. Villegas at one point was, we'll see. He was the leader of the Latino caucus in city council. He at one point was Mayor Lightfoot's floor leader. So we'll see what he how independent he is, and if in city council, in the new city council, and continue to watch how he'll work with the ward.
Yeah, Buddy was hoping for a different job last. He was trying to get up out of there.
He was trying. He ran for congressman as well. He lost that. Yes.
Now you got to deal with the snake. So we'll see how it works. Kicking it over to producer Simone Alicea. We got to hit up the 45th ward on the northwest side. We got a lot of listeners up in that ward. Who is their alderperson now?
Their alderperson for a second term is Jim Gardner. Jim Gardner beat attorney Megan Mathias. And so the 45th ward covers Old Irving Park, Portage Park, Jefferson Park, and also parts of Forest Glen and Norwood Park. This was something we were watching because Gardner has faced just a series of allegations of bribery, harassment, intimidation. And it was thought that he would have a really tough path to re-election as a result of those allegations, but actually did really well on he did fairly well in February. He almost avoided a runoff altogether, and then did really well here in April as well, winning by something like 11 percentage points. So it will be interesting to see how that sort of shakes out through his second term, how he deals with those allegations, and also what comes of ongoing investigations into his behavior in office, in addition to issues like business development that are really big in the ward.
Mm-hmm. And then finishing out up near you in the 46th ward, again, as we talked about wards that were sort of lake adjacent on the north and south side, many of them, if not most of them, were getting new alderpersons, and that was the case up in the 46th. So who is that person today?
Angela Clay is a community organizer who has won in the 46th ward, which covers Uptown and parts of Lakeview. This was an open seat with James Kappelman retiring, longtime alder. And Clay really sort of ran on a position of more services for housing, mental health, which is a really big issue in Uptown, which has sort of historically been a seat for those services in the city. So those are going to be big issues here, as well as just sort of ongoing gentrification and the way the neighborhoods have changed a lot over the years. So it will be interesting to see how she tackles those issues.
Yeah, one of the big questions is, how is this new mayor going to work with this new city council? On one side, you've got a mayor who's maybe hoping to expand their own powers, get their own agenda through. And on the other side, you have a city council that has recently made more moves to be independent. But again, with so many new faces, there's so much possibility for coalition building, for new relationships. So we'll see if it looked anything like the last administration. For full results, please check the show notes where we've got links to the Chicago Board of Elections. Also, check out our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago, for more details at chicago.citycast.fm. Thank you for listening to us. Shout out to lead producer Carrie Shepard, to producer Simone Alicea, our newsletter writer Sydney Madden, for all the work y'all have done during this election season. And now, the real work starts. Obviously, we ain't going nowhere. We're going to be back here tomorrow. Hopefully, you'll join us. Peace. I'm getting the wrap it up symbol. They telling me to wrap it up, B. Wrap it up. Wrap it up.